This one is, well, kind of intuitive if you just read the title. Electric vehicle batteries will dwarf the grid's energy storage needs. Article in Forbes magazine. It was based on a less journalistic source, more serious research. But if you're interested in that, and it's in the link in our outline. And so this is what we're saying. Use a distributed smart grid of plugged in electric vehicles to store and release electricity as needed. So remember how we mentioned we could use industrial scale batteries or hydrogen to store the excess electricity and then release it when we don't have enough. We could combine that with a smart grid, in other words, a grid that has built into it some adaptive capabilities, managed capabilities, where you could have a whole distributed system over large areas where people would have their cars plugged in either at home or their place of employment or both. And electric vehicles could store excess electricity. Let's say there's a peak in solar in the middle of the day when they're at work, they're plugged into a grid there, or at home if they're working at home, and they could store electricity in those batteries. And then in the evening, maybe there's a time when there's peak electricity demand with AC, say in the summer, and they could release that. Okay, that electricity just plugged into the grid, just have a program in there to release so much, and they could get a more premium price for it because electricity is more dear in the evening when there's not as much in that kind of solar dominated system or whatever the configuration is. Okay, so maybe you have a wave energy dominated system where there's ups and downs in that to some degree, and those peak times, which are very predictable, you could use that. This sort of thing, okay? And so this has a great potential, and there's some other articles as well. If you just kind of Google that topic to get a sense of how that would work, the potential is enormous, and it would be a system that would have a high kind of stability to it because it would be geographically distributed as well, not only the grid, but also the storage of it. And people could literally make a profit on electricity with their cars by having them parked and absorbing electricity or taking it in when electricity is really, really cheap, and then reselling it back to the grid when it's expensive. You have about a 10% power loss, by the way, in a system like that, in case you were wondering. Estimates suggest that. Okay. The next one is demand side management, including time of day pricing. Okay. So the time of day pricing basically is, I've already mentioned it in some ways when I talked about when electricity is dear. Okay. So here in the Northwest, for the most part, we don't have a time of day pricing, though we could. We do have that stable hydropower, and historically we just haven't needed to do that. But we kind of have a system like that anyway, historically, where we've sent some of our hydro to California when they have peak demands, and that's typically their AC season. And then they'll send it back to us in the evening when they don't need it, and we can then use that here to support our grid in the evening without using much hydro at all. And we've usually had a favorable price exchange. But in recent years, with the advent of more and more solar in California, that's rare, okay, compared with what it used to be. But the way this would work again is basically there's a pricing where when there's a lot of electricity available, it's cheap. And when it's not cheap, then you wouldn't be using so much. So that's demand side management. It's like, okay, we're not going to run our closed cycle, for example, washer dryer, until electricity is cheaper, say maybe later in the evening or whatever time of day that might happen in a particular place. And of course, there will be kind of a geography and a time difference in that of day and night. And the smarter grid with smarter appliances could be programmed to run, or you could just do it manually, run them when the electricity costs less money, saving you money, and using electricity only when it's in excess, that sort of thing. So you can demand side management, for example, with your freezer and with a good, well-built refrigerator as well, that sort of demand side management. Some industrial processes can be managed that way as well. Okay, so lots of possibilities there. And in fact, I will have posted a short video. It's about 4 minutes that describes some of that too. Okay, the next one, number 9. There's other promising approaches. Compressed air, the French are particularly good at that. We do have some big caverns in the southeast that use compressed air. Basically, pump it into a cavern when you have an excess of electricity, and then it's released back out, spins a turbine, generates electricity on the other side. So again, that's a proven technology, and it already is used in the United States in the Tennessee Valley Authority projects. Flywheels is another one. Here's an interesting one: hybrid desalination systems. So in places in the world where there's a shortage of fresh water, and the Middle East is one, Southern California is another, and they're desalinizing water from the sea for drinking water. That's an energy intensive process. But if you've got lots of sun and you've got lots of solar farms built and you have a peak in solar production, so much so that the solar electricity becomes almost worthless, you can use that kind of a system during that time to do this desalination with almost zero energy cost. Okay. And so what used to be a process that we use fossil fuels to do, we could use solar energy or wind to do. And we could lower the overall cost of the system if we became industrially efficient at that, and also do something maybe a little better for our planet. Maybe do less groundwater pumping, which would be less expensive if you're going deep in wells to get water to use to process into drinking water, that sort of thing. Okay. And then there's last resorts. Okay. Here's some things to jot down on last resorts. Okay. Definitely videos recommended in this because we're trying to convey some kind of complex topics. So what do you write down here on number 10? What are the last resorts? Let's say that all of the above works most of the time, but we still have a setting maybe where we've got 4 or 5 days where there's just going to be really, really tough to meet all of the electricity demand using all of the above combined approaches. What can we do? Okay, so one thing that can be done, and this is already done in parts of the world, is to use biofuels. Okay, so you have photosynthesis taking in carbon dioxide, and then later you're combusting it. Okay, and you use biofuels to generate electricity in thermal plants. Okay, that it would be then maybe become a next priority. Rarely are those systems carbon neutral, but at least there is some carbon being taken up even as later it's being combusted. So kind of a last resort, but even more ultimate last resort in a world where we're trying not to combust fossil fuels and put more carbon dioxide and methane in the air would be to use fossil fuels for those. So, well, excuse me, the next tier that's less desirable but not the worst would be to continue maybe to use nuclear plants, or maybe even build some if we could do that in a lower cost way. And nuclear energy plants are very expensive, and the cost per kilowatt hour, as you later look at the Lazard's graphs that I have for you, is actually quite expensive. So you wouldn't want to do that just from expense reasons, number one. And then, of course, there's other problems with nuclear energy. Not going to get into that here, but at least that's a possibility. Continue to use our nuke plants, or if we could find some that have more of a passive shutdown systems that present lower risks, and we figure out what to do with the waste, maybe down the road. But the problem with going with nuclear, it takes about 8 to 10 years to build a plant. We don't have 8 to 10 years. Okay, the Paris climate change goals tell us that we need to act much more quickly than on 10-year horizons. But maybe we could build some on the side and integrate them into such systems down the road. And then finally, the other kind of thermal plants I suggested before, maybe you have continue on with natural gas peak plants, or peaker plants they're called, that you could just crank them up on a minute's notice and run for electricity use, electricity generation and use. You can do the same with coal plants as well, coal-fired plants. Again, those are emitting carbon dioxide, so we're trying to avoid that. But it'll be for a while that maybe these will be necessary as we build out an infrastructure. Okay, so you probably sense some optimism here. I believe, I've been studying this for over 2 decades. I really believe reading the technical reports. I'm kind of a nerd on this. I've been reading this stuff for years, going to conferences, talking with experts. I really think this is doable. We still don't have all of the questions answered, but of course not, because we haven't really made a serious attempt at this yet. If we were serious, we could, I believe, do this. We have almost all the technologies ready to go, with the exception of the wave. We don't really need the wave energy, but it would be nice, as we said, for the reasons we gave. But anyway, I feel this optimism about this, and I'm glad to share that, because much of sustainability studies, frankly, is pretty gloom and doom. This is the cool stuff. This is exciting stuff. I'm glad some of you wanted to have this shared in this class, so I'm sharing it with you, and hopefully this makes some sense to you. Okay, make sure you look at, by the way, the levelized cost of energy graphs that are part of this unit as well. I think you'll find that encouraging as well. Been some great progress on renewable energy cost. Okay, thanks.